Perspectives on Administrative Responsibility and the Evaluation of Public Records. Madam, I am present here to offer a solitary, uncomplicated inquiry for your consideration on this day. Just a single point of interest after your 20-year tenure as a criminal prosecutor, following your 4-year term serving as the Vice President, and after a comprehensive lifetime dedicated to the landscape of public service, are you capable of identifying even one specific resolution from your professional history that you truly lament? Just one, and I encourage you to contemplate the matter at your own pace. As the Senate Judiciary Committee room remains crowded, and every significant broadcasting network is transmitting this event to a live audience. Miss Harris occupies her position at the evidentiary podium, wearing a high-end designer garment and maintaining a carefully practiced expression, having likely assumed this would be a perfunctory appearance regarding the nuances of criminal justice legislation, completely unaware of the specific narrative that is about to unfold. Situated directly opposite her is Vice President J.D. Vance, who is attired in a modest, dark-toned suit without an elaborate necktie, but noticeably wearing a Marine Corps insignia upon his lapel. A yellow legal writing tablet rests on the surface before him, though he has not cast a single glance toward it, because he has arrived with several specific instances of regret to articulate to you, Madam former Vice President, concerning your historical record and the various determinations you authorized, which significantly impacted the lives of private citizens. And over the course of the following few hours, we shall examine these occurrences in a sequential manner. He unfastens a substantial evidentiary dossier that is remarkably thick, meticulously structured, and segmented with numerous organizational tabs, suggesting we should initiate our discussion with the case of a law enforcement officer named Isaac Espinoza, and he inquires if that specific name resonates within your memory. The expression on the face of Miss Harris loses its warmth and no longer appears genuine in her eyes, as observers may now witness her attempt to redirect the conversation toward her established progressive achievements rather than focusing on the tragic loss of a police officer. Senator Vance, she begins, deliberately utilizing his previous legislative title as a subtle assertion of social standing, noting that the legal matter in question concluded more than 2 decades ago, and she arrived at a principled conclusion rooted in her personal opposition to the implementation of capital punishment. Corporal Vance, actually, his voice intervenes with a tone that is remarkably composed and exacting, mentioning that he achieved that specific rank during his service in the Marine Corps, though he suggests they may continue with the title of Mr. Vance, if she prefers that manner of address. The entire chamber descends into a state of profound stillness, and he agrees that they should indeed discuss her personal principles, specifically those values that placed her in direct opposition to the late Senator Dianne Feinstein, to Senator Barbara Boxer, to the Attorney General of California, and to the entirety of the San Francisco Police Department. He continues listing those who were at odds with her decision, including the grieving widow of Officer Espinoza and his young daughter, remarking on the steadfastness of her principles before he retrieves a specific document and offers to read an excerpt for the record. This text originates from the then California Attorney General Bill Lockyer during the funeral services for Officer Espinoza, occurring while the officer's widow was seated in the foremost row and while their 9-year-old daughter clutched her mother's hand. Mr. Vance pauses briefly, allowing the gravity of the moment to be felt by the audience before delivering the quote. If you arrive at legal charging determinations based upon a personal philosophical worldview rather than upon the objective facts of a case, I shall exercise my authority to remove that case from your jurisdiction. The quotation concludes, followed by an even more extended silence this time, as he clarifies that the Attorney General was speaking specifically about her conduct during the funeral of a fallen officer, illustrating how remarkably problematic her decision was perceived to be. Ms. Harris shifts her physical position in her chair, adopting a tone often associated with a condescending prosecutor as she addresses him as Senator, then corrects herself to Mr. Vance, stating that the death penalty is an inherently multifaceted issue. It is not a complex matter. Let me simplify the situation for you, Mr. Vance responds with a voice that remains steady and patient, as if he were clarifying a basic concept to a young child. He recounts that Officer Isaac Espinoza was 29 years of age on April 10, 2004, performing a plainclothes patrol in the Bayview district of San Francisco when he and his professional partner engaged a suspect following standard operating protocols, and as Officer Espinoza exited the unmarked police vehicle and activated his flashlight, he pauses to let the tension in the room escalate. David Hill initiated an assault with an AK-47 automatic firearm, discharging numerous rounds of ammunition, two of which struck Officer Espinoza and resulted in his immediate death, while two additional bullets hit his partner and nearly claimed his life as well. The chamber remains entirely hushed, save for the faint mechanical sound of the recording cameras as he lists the charges: first-degree homicide, assault on a peace officer with a lethal instrument, and the utilization of a military-grade weapon in the execution of a felony. This incident was not a case of manslaughter, nor was it a matter of self-defense. It was a cold-blooded execution of a law enforcement officer with a powerful rifle. Mr. Vance raises his eyes from the documentation and looks directly at Miss Harris, stating that she faced a fundamental decision between seeking the ultimate penalty for the killer of a policeman or utilizing the tragedy to make a political declaration, and he asks which path she chose to follow. Miss Harris leans her body forward in an attempt to reclaim the narrative, arguing that research regarding the death penalty has demonstrated certain trends. But Mr. Vance interrupts her, demanding a simple affirmative or negative response as to whether she sought the maximum penalty. She continues to cite research indicating that capital punishment fails to serve as a deterrent, but he repeatedly asks for a yes or no answer until a lengthy silence ensues, during which the sensitive microphones capture the sound of her breathing, becoming quick and shallow. "No, I did not pursue the death penalty," she finally admits, and Mr. Vance expresses his gratitude while making a slow and deliberate notation on his pad, ensuring she observes him recording the response. He then notes that during the funeral of Officer Espinoza, a truly extraordinary event took place. Senator Dianne Feinstein, a prominent Democrat from your own political affiliation and your home state of California, stood before the mourners and declared that you were incorrect and that you should have pursued the maximum penalty, and he asks if she recalls that public rebuke. "I am aware that there were differing opinions on the matter," she responds, and he reminds her that the senator broke with her in a very public fashion at a funeral, as did Senator Barbara Boxer. Both of those Democratic senators from her state were known for being pro-choice and generally skeptical of capital punishment. Yet, these liberal figures both concluded that she had overstepped a boundary, and he asks if this causes her to reflect. Harris attempts to use her characteristic nervous laughter, which begins at a high pitch and then fades away in her throat as she realizes no one in the room is laughing with her, and the resulting silence is even more uncomfortable. "Well, it is impossible for everyone to be in agreement," she says, but he points out that the San Francisco Police Officers Association described her determination as a profound betrayal. He emphasizes that the police union, the individuals who put their lives at risk every single day, asserted that she prioritized her political aspirations over their safety, and he asks if they were mistaken. Silence follows as she reaches for her container of water, and her hand exhibits a slight tremor, which causes the glass to rattle against the table, a sound clearly picked up by the high-quality microphones before she sets it back down without taking a drink. She claims the issue contains more nuance than suggested, but he counters that Attorney General Bill Lockyer did not view it as nuanced when he threatened to strip her of the case, and he asks if she realizes how extraordinary it is for a state official to threaten a local district attorney in such a manner, particularly during a victim's memorial service. Mr. Intex, Vance produces another document and reads an editorial from the San Francisco Chronicle, dated April 21, 2004, which stated that her refusal to seek the death penalty had initiated an unprecedented division between the new district attorney and the local law enforcement community. The article noted that officers were openly questioning whether she could be relied upon to seek the appropriate level of justice for those who had fallen in the line of duty. He looks up from the paper and observes that this occurred only 3 months into her tenure, meaning she had already alienated the trust of the entire police department. Miss Harris attempts to find a stronger tone of voice, asserting that she made a determination based on her profound personal convictions. Mr. Vance nods slowly and suggests they calculate the actual human cost of those convictions. 1 deceased police officer, 1 mourning widow, and a daughter named Sophia, who was forced to grow up without her father. He also lists the loss of faith within the police department, the public condemnation from 2 senators of her own party, the threat from the Attorney General, and the fact that a cop killer was allowed to live, all as a result of her convictions, before closing that specific section of his folder. The sound of the folder closing echoes through the quiet chamber, and he mentions that they have 9 additional controversies to examine today. But he asks her to consider, 20 years later, if she regrets that choice. He asks if she thinks of Sophia Espinosa or the officer's widow, or if she ever questions whether her progressive ideology was worth the immense suffering she inflicted upon that specific family. Miss Harris adjusts her posture and adopts a voice of rehearsed empathy typically used in her public addresses, stating she understands the difficulties faced by law enforcement families, but he interrupts to ask again for a yes or no answer on whether she regrets it. These choices are never easy, she starts. But he points out that Officer Espinosa's daughter is now 30 years old, having been only 9 when her father's killer was spared, what many considered to be the appropriate justice. He notes that she is present in the room today, seated in the 3rd row of the center section, and while he does not point, the cameras quickly locate Sophia Espinosa, a professional woman in her early 30s, who is crying silently while maintaining her dignity. He asks Miss Harris if she would like to inform Sophia directly that she believes she made the correct decision, leaving the Senate chamber in a state of absolute silence, except for the quiet sound of Sophia's weeping as everyone waits for a response. Miss Harris attempts to speak but finds no words, and a silence of 15 seconds passes while the hum of the air conditioning and a muffled phone vibration are the only sounds heard. "That is precisely what I anticipated, Mr." Vance says in a voice that is now quieter and more menacing, before suggesting they move on to the next topic. Somewhere in the Democratic area of the room, a senator stands up, gathers his materials, and exits the chamber in a way that seems almost apologetic, and the sound of the door clicking shut is clearly heard by Miss Harris. "That is the first scandal, Mr." Vance remarks, citing it as a catastrophic failure of judgment and a family devastated by her principles, and he warns that they are only beginning their review. He notes that things will become even more revealing because she frequently speaks about themes of racial justice and criminal justice reform, portraying herself as a progressive prosecutor who is concerned with the lives of black citizens. He asks if she is familiar with the name Jamal Truelove, and that forced, condescending smile reappears as she mentions she handled thousands of cases during her time as a district attorney. He identifies Jamal Truelove as the black man whom her office erroneously convicted of homicide, an innocent individual who spent 6 years in a correctional facility for a crime he did not commit, and who was physically assaulted while serving that sentence, and he asks if that name is familiar now. The smile vanishes as Mr. Vance anticipates her defense that she did not personally litigate every case, and that she managed a large office with many assistants, which he admits is partially true. However, he asserts that being in a leadership position means the failures of the office belong to her as well, particularly when those failures involve the suppression of evidence and the presentation of dishonest testimony, as he retrieves a new section from his dossier. Jamal Truelove was convicted of murder in 2007 under her administration, and spent 6 years in San Quentin State Prison. 6 years of his life that were effectively stolen for an act he did not commit. Mr. Vance looks at her and explains that they know he was innocent because his conviction was overturned in 2015 due to prosecutorial misconduct. He details that her office withheld evidence that would have proven his innocence and presented testimony known to be unreliable, thereby destroying an innocent man's life. Ms. Harris begins to state she was not personally involved, but he offers to read a quote from Jamal Truelove himself from an interview conducted after he successfully sued the city. Mr. Vance reads the transcript where Mr. Truelove recalled looking at Kamala Harris in court and seeing her literally burst out laughing while they locked eyes. He lets that statement sink in, pointing out that she laughed at an innocent black man who was facing a life sentence because of her office's professional misconduct. That is a falsehood, Miss. Harris responds with a sharp and defensive tone, but he notes that Mr. Truelove made that statement under oath during a deposition and asks if she would like to initiate a defamation lawsuit against him. The jury in that case believed him, he continues, finding in his favor regarding wrongful imprisonment and civil rights violations, which resulted in the city of San Francisco paying a settlement of $13.1 million. He emphasizes that $13.1 million of taxpayer funds were required to compensate for her office's failure, and he allows that figure to resonate in the room. Miss Harris tries to characterize the justice system as imperfect and mentions her work on reform, but Mr. Vance tells her to stop, dismissing her response as a mere talking point. He reminds her that Jamal Truelove is an actual human being whose life was shattered, not a statistic or a policy debate, and when she claims to take full responsibility, he questions the sincerity of that statement. He notes that she spent the previous 5 minutes attempting to evade responsibility by citing the size of her office and the imperfections of the system, which he characterizes as excuses rather than apologies. He points out the stark contrast between Mr. Truelove being assaulted in prison and her building a political career and running for Attorney General while speaking about justice and reform. He mentions her book, Smart on Crime, which he calls a plagiarized work to be discussed later, noting that she wrote about the necessity for accountability, while one of her victims was still suffering in prison for her office's errors. Miss Harris is visibly frustrated, her teeth grinding as the microphones capture the sound, while he asks how that history aligns with the progressive prosecutor image she used to build her political brand. She begins to repeat that the system is imperfect, but he counters that she was not a victim of that system. She was the system itself, and she utilized her power to ruin an innocent man while reportedly laughing during the legal process. In the audience, several black religious leaders who had arrived to offer her support appear visibly uncomfortable, and one removes a Justice for All button before quietly exiting the chamber. Others follow suit in a small, quiet exodus, and the sound of the doors opening and closing is repeated as Miss Harris's breathing becomes more labored. Mr. Vance then mentions that Jamal Trulove has actually endorsed Donald Trump, noting the irony of a black man from a very liberal city supporting a Republican candidate because of the actions she took against him. He closes that section of the folder, summarizing that they have now reviewed 2 lives destroyed and 2 major failures, and they have not yet reached the halfway point of the hearing. A complete silence fills the room, broken only by the sound of the air conditioning as Miss Harris drinks the remainder of her water with a visibly shaking hand. Mr. Vance suggests they move from her past as a prosecutor to her more recent failures as a national candidate, implying she did not learn from her earlier mistakes. He produces a thicker section of documents regarding her 2024 presidential campaign and her selection of a running mate, noting that she needed someone competent and free of scandal. He then mentions she chose Tim Walz, which elicits a ripple of laughter from the Republican side of the room and some uncomfortable smiles from the Democrats. He clarifies that they are not discussing her historical election loss today, but rather the failure to properly investigate Mr. Walz before placing him a heartbeat away from the presidency. Miss Harris tries to defend the choice as based on the information available at the time, noting that Governor Walz seemed like a stable Midwestern teacher and veteran. However, Mr. Vance points out that by the time he was selected, Minnesota was embroiled in one of the most significant fraud scandals in the history of the country, specifically the Feeding Our Future case, involving billions of dollars. He holds up a document regarding the $9 billion fraud that occurred under the governor's oversight and asks if she was aware of this when she made her selection. She attempts to say every state has issues, but he demands a yes or no answer on whether she knew. And when she tries to hide behind the confidentiality of the vetting process, he points out that the scandal was a matter of public record. He notes that the FBI had already made arrests and federal indictments had been filed, making it front-page news rather than a secret investigation, and he asks again if her team informed her of the $9 billion in fraud. Her legal counsel whispers to her, and she responds that she cannot discuss internal vetting, which he interprets as an admission that she knew and proceeded anyway. He then outlines a timeline where a nonprofit was supposed to provide meals for children during the pandemic, but instead engaged in massive fraud, including shell companies and money laundering. He notes the FBI investigation began in 2021, 3 years before she selected Mr. Walz, and that 70 people had been charged with stealing $250 million by the time he was announced, with total fraud estimates reaching $9 billion. He puts that $9 billion into perspective, noting it is larger than the annual budgets of some states and enough to operate the Minnesota government for 2 months. Yet, it was stolen while Mr. Walz was governor. Miss Harris tries to argue that a governor does not oversee every program, but Mr. Vance counters that as a trained prosecutor, she should have evaluated the evidence of his incompetence. He asks what it says about her judgment that she viewed a governor whose state was hemorrhaging billions of dollars as good enough for the vice presidency. She claims the vetting was extensive, but he asserts that it failed spectacularly because Mr. Walz recently had to abandon his re-election bid due to the very fraud scandal she ignored. He reads a quote from a retired State Patrol lieutenant who noted that the vetting clearly failed because the scandals were public and raised serious questions about oversight. Mr. Vance asks if she was incompetent for not knowing or reckless for knowing and ignoring the facts, and she is seen gripping the table until her knuckles turn white. He characterizes her judgment as consistently catastrophic, noting that more Democrats are now leaving the chamber in a visible exodus. He summarizes the 3 scandals reviewed thus far: a murdered officer denied justice, an innocent man imprisoned, and a $9 billion fraud ignored. Ms. Harris describes the hearing as a partisan attack, but Mr. Vance dismisses this, stating it is about accountability and truth. He then moves to a new section of documents involving media protection and the editing of her public interviews to make her appear more coherent. He presents a document regarding her October 202460 minutes interview, where she gave what he calls a word salad response about foreign policy in Israel. He reads the incoherent transcript and notes that it exposed her as being unprepared for the presidency. However, he points out that when the full interview aired, CBS had edited in a different, more coherent response from a separate part of the discussion. He notes that Donald Trump called it a significant scandal, and while he acknowledges Trump's love of hyperbole, he asserts that the fact CBS felt the need to protect her by editing the footage is telling. She claims she does not control editorial decisions, but he asks if her campaign requested the changes to make her sound more articulate. He suggests she was either complicit in deceiving the public or so incompetent that the media felt they had to cover for her. He also brings up an interview on The View where she was asked if she would have done anything differently than President Biden, and she replied that nothing came to mind. He notes the audible groans from the room, pointing out she could not differentiate herself from an unpopular president whose own party had asked him to step down. He references her own memoir, 107 Days, where she admitted that her answer was like pulling the pin on a hand grenade and that her staff was distraught. He asks why Americans should have elected her if she planned to be exactly like the incumbent that the public was unhappy with. She attempts the nervous laugh again, but he tells her she lost the election because the interviews showed she was not ready and could not handle basic inquiries without media assistance. 5 more Democrats exit the chamber, leaving only a tired-looking Bernie Sanders, as Mr. Vance counts the 4 scandals reviewed so far. Mr. Vance promises the next topics are even more concerning as he introduces her 2009 book, Smart on Crime, which he claims was not written honestly. He asks if she knows the definition of plagiarism, and when she says she does, he defines it as intellectual theft. He presents an analysis from a plagiarism expert who concluded that the book contained clear and unambiguous instances of copied material. He specifically mentions 2 paragraphs copied directly from Wikipedia, including a factual error that was present on the website but not in the original source documents. He characterizes this as a pattern of intellectual dishonesty and dismisses her lawyer's excuse that a ghostwriter was responsible, noting her name is the one on the cover. He asks what happens to law students who are caught plagiarizing, noting they are usually expelled and their careers are ended. Yet she used a plagiarized book to build her career without consequence. He points out the irony of the title Smart on Crime when it involved such an easily detectable fraud. A law professor in the gallery, a former classmate, exits the room in disgust as Mr. Vance summarizes that they have now covered 5 major scandals of incompetence and deception. He moves to the final section regarding her shifting stances on law enforcement, noting that in her book she wrote that more police leads to more safety. He then quotes a 2020 interview where she said the exact opposite, claiming that more police on the streets is just wrong. He asks which statement was a lie, suggesting her views changed only when it became politically convenient to support the defund the police movement. He mentions her promotion of the Minnesota Freedom Fund, which bailed out violent criminals, including one who went on to commit a homicide while out on bail. He also notes she supported cutting the police budget in Los Angeles, and that crime subsequently rose in many cities. Finally, he addresses the border crisis, noting she was appointed border czar and presided over record-high illegal crossings and over 100,000 fentanyl deaths. He points out that she did not even visit the border for 90 days after her appointment, focusing instead on root causes while the situation worsened. He also mentions her actions as Attorney General of California, where she targeted conservative nonprofits by forcing them to disclose donor lists, which the Supreme Court later ruled was unconstitutional. He concludes by summarizing the 6 documented scandals, characterizing her career as one of failing upward while leaving behind a trail of destruction. He asks why Americans rejected her, asserting it was not due to her identity, but because they saw her as an incompetent politician protected by institutions. He moves to refer the findings to the Department of Justice for potential investigation into prosecutorial misconduct and abuse of authority. Ms. Harris sits in silence as Mr. Vance exits the room with the posture of a confident Marine, leaving her political career in ruins. In the following 30 minutes, the media landscape erupts, with even Democratic-aligned networks struggling to defend her in the face of such overwhelming evidence. Social media is flooded with mentions of the hearing, and the video of her silence goes viral globally. Within hours, even influential figures like Nancy Pelosi and Gavin Newsom distance themselves or call for investigations, and major donors begin to demand refunds. Her book is pulled from shelves as the public focuses on the human stories, like that of Sophia Espinoza, who finally feels validated after 20 years of waiting for justice for her father. Jamal Truelove also releases a statement, explaining that he supports the figures who actually hold corrupt prosecutors accountable, regardless of party. The San Francisco Police Officers Association announces an award for integrity in the name of Isaac Espinoza, ensuring Harris's name is never associated with it. Organizations that once championed her begin to scrub her from their history, as she eventually releases a brief statement announcing her retirement from public life. 3 months later, J.D. Vance reflects on the hearing with young Marines, stating that he did not destroy her career. She destroyed it herself through 20 years of poor decisions, and that truth and accountability must always be the priority in public service.